Okay, so welcome everybody to the last town and gown of 2021. Thanks so much for joining us over the past several months. I've just emailed a Word document that contains at least most of the participants who will be presenting in the spring and the summer. And it's a really, really good lineup. So please do have a look at that. And if you have suggestions for topics which aren't covered, by all means, fill out that online survey or just email me directly. So this is a great note on which to end. Dr. Erica Frantz is a very, very accomplished faculty member of MSU, and really delighted to see you here. I'm going to hand over now to Macon, who will introduce our speaker. So thank you.
Yeah, sure thing, Dr. Weller, and good evening, everyone, and happy holidays as we go into this new year and move forward into 2022. So I'm here tonight to introduce Dr. Erica Frantz, who is a very beloved faculty member here at MSU. She's associated with the Department of Political Science, and she's conducted a lot of important work about the conditions that promote or undermine dictatorships, particularly in the developing world, which many of you might know as the Third World or some other moniker like that. Dr. Frantz specializes in the study and teaching of authoritarian politics, democratization, conflict, and development. She is particularly interested in the security and policy implications of autocratic rule in the developing world. She's published numerous books, including Democracies and Authoritarian Regimes in the Oxford University Press, Authoritarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know, also the Oxford University Press, How Dictatorships Work, Cambridge University, and Development and the State in the 21st Century from Palgrave Publishing. She's an accomplished professor, and in 2020, Professor Frantz won MSU's College of Social Science Outstanding Teacher Award. At MSU, she teaches both Political Science 200, which is just the introduction class that all the up-and-coming freshmen have to take. And then she also teaches a really lovely Politics of Developing Areas course, which I had the pleasure of taking last spring. Professor Frantz is passionate, driven, energetic, and it's an honor to have her here. So with that, I'd be happy to pass the torch to her.
Thank you so much, Mac, and I didn't know you were going to be here, and it's nice to see you again. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and John, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm looking forward to it. I think the next step is I need to share my screen, right? Yes, okay, so let's see if I can figure this out here. Okay. All right, is that visible to everyone? Okay, I'm going to talk about new technologies at the end of the talk, and I'm terrible with new technologies, so I'm happy that this part at least is working. Okay, so I'm going to speak to you today about how today's democracies fall apart. And unfortunately, it's kind of a doomsday message about the state of democracy in the world. But let me go ahead and this is going to be a very broad conversation. I'm happy to get into more of the details of some of these dynamics later in the Q&A, but I'm going to try to keep things fairly simple for now. Okay, I'm going to start with good news. And this is a map that shows all the world's countries rated by the organization Freedom House in 2020. So the dark green countries are going to be those that are considered to be free. And in this conceptualization, free basically means democratic. So you can think of all these green countries as democracies. The yellows are the partly frees, and then the purples are the not frees. So the purples are going to be the dictatorships. So the good news here is that a majority of the world's countries are actually free. They're governed by democracy. And that is a fairly sizable change since the end of the Cold War. The last 40 years, however, have seen a nice progression of democratic stability and spread globally. And I can get into later why democracy tends to be good in terms of outcomes that we might care about. Okay, so lots of the world's countries are democratic, but there's some bad news, as I mentioned. So this also uses data from Freedom House to show improvements and declines in freedom globally. And the improvements are the blues and the declines are the pinks. And what you can see is that those declines are outnumbering the improvements for many years. And in fact, Freedom House has documented 14 consecutive years in a row where declines in freedom are outpacing improvements. And when I started doing research on this about a decade ago, it was shocking at the time that there had been 3 or 4 consecutive years of declines in freedom outpacing improvements. But now we're seeing that it just keeps happening where global freedom seems to be under threat. Now, to be clear, in some instances, these declines in freedom are happening in places that are already authoritarian. So an example would be Russia entrenching its authoritarianism. Things are just getting worse there. And in other instances, these declines are happening in democracies that, though decreasing in the quality of democratic rule, still maintain democracy. And good examples there would be India, where the quality of its democracy has certainly declined in recent years. Another good example would be the United States. I can talk about the United States in more detail later. But both of those places are still democracies, albeit ones that are weaker than they were in years past. In other instances, however, these declines in freedom are actually paving the way for the establishment of new dictatorships. And a very good example from recent years of this would be Turkey. Most people are aware that the Turkish regime is authoritarian now under Erdogan, but we forget that for many years, Turkey was democratic and in fact, kind of a beacon of democracy in that part of the world. So it had had a stint of authoritarianism in the 1980s, that was 3 years, but otherwise has been democratic for some time. Under Erdogan's tenure, however, we've seen declines in democracy that are so serious that most observers classify Turkey as authoritarian. Okay, so that gets into my next point, which is when democratic decline leads to democratic collapse. And here indeed we have Erdogan casting a ballot at the polls in an electoral contest that was rigged in his favor. So just because we have elections does not mean that they're free and fair. Something else that I can talk about. Okay, so we're seeing that these declines are in some instances leading to democratic collapse. And what is particularly important is that the way in which democracy is collapsing has changed. So what has happened in Turkey, where you have this leader, Erdogan, who was elected in free and fair elections originally, we have the situation where this leader, over the course of a number of years, undermines that country's democratic institutions and ushers the way for a transition to dictatorship. These sorts of incumbent-led takeovers, I will refer to as authoritarianizations. I know that's a really clunky term, but that's the one that we use. Authoritarianization basically means a democratically elected leader transitioning the country towards dictatorship. So today I'm going to talk about the fact that today's democracies, contemporary democracies, are increasingly falling apart from within through this process called authoritarianization. I'm also going to discuss why that matters. Why should you care that the way that democracies are falling apart has changed? One of the big reasons why you should care is that this specific type of mode of democratic collapse is leading to a rise in strongman rule, which is in fact the most dangerous form of authoritarianism. So of all the types of dictatorships that you would want to see in the world, you really don't want to see these places where a single individual holds most of the reins of power. Okay, so these are going to be the major themes today. I'm also going to emphasize that one of the difficulties of this evolution in how dictatorships form is that pushing back against the trend requires an understanding of the factors that trigger it. And that is kind of a big gaping hole in the literature. We don't necessarily have a very good understanding of some of the conditions that give rise to this. I'm currently working on a book project that seeks to better understand this, which I will reference briefly towards the end of the talk. But these are going to be kind of the major themes that I'm going to cover. Okay, to get things started, it's important to talk about how democracies can collapse. And there are basically two major methods. The first is coerced, where it happens through force. And this is typically either through a coup or a rebellion, an uprising, a foreign power intervening to unseat the democracy. And this in many ways is kind of our stereotypical understanding of a democracy ending. Here I have an image from Brazil in 1964, where they had a military coup. That led to about 2 decades of military rule in Brazil. And this is kind of how we think of how a democracy should end, that the military is going to storm a presidential palace and hit the streets, and democracy will be over. But democracies can also fall apart without the use of force through non-coerced transitions. And these are really encompassed by authoritarianizations. Let me get into some more details about how these modes of transition differ from each other. Okay, I'm going to start with an example from Chile, which experienced a coup in 1973. So Chilean democracy also was heralded as very stable. And then in 1973, Chilean troops staged a coup and ousted Salvador Allende, who was a democratically elected leader. So Allende might not have been popular, particularly with the US, but he was democratically elected. The military then intervenes, storms the presidential palace, and attacks until Allende eventually takes his own life. This ushered in a military junta with Augusto Pinochet at the leadership. The key thing here is that the demise of Chilean democracy happened in a single day. It happened the day in September 11th, 1973, when Pinochet and his troops gained control. Now contrast this with another example from Latin America, Venezuela. So Venezuela had also been democratic for some time. Hugo Chavez won free and fair elections in 1998. Now, Venezuela is in the news so much with the terrible things that have happened under the Maduro regime. But we often forget that Chavez won democratic elections in 1998. There was no foul play at all. But since he came to power, trouble brewed. There were a number of actions that Chavez pursued that slowly dismantled constraints to his rule and eventually paved the way for dictatorship to take shape. So he expanded the size of the Supreme Court and allowed judges to be dismissed by majority vote. All of this favored him. He then stacked the Supreme Court with his loyalists, and anybody who opposed him in the judiciary was soon replaced. He also published a list of individuals who had signed a recall petition. And these individuals were then dismissed from public jobs and they lost their welfare benefits. So it suddenly became very consequential to indicate any lack of support for Chavez. He also passed laws targeting the media and constraining their reporting. He began to paint a picture of his opponents as not just, against his leadership, but as against the system as a whole, as anti-revolutionaries. And then the final point to mention here before I get on to the next slide is that identifying the date that Venezuelan democracy fell apart is actually pretty tricky. So most observers now have coalesced on the year 2005 as the year that Venezuelan democracy ended. But there was a lot of murkiness because all of these things that Chavez did were kind of unsettling. They didn't seem consistent with democracy, but were they enough to call Venezuela a dictatorship? In the end, the 2005 legislative elections featured an opposition boycott. So they had put out these fingerprint machines at the polling places. So if you were to vote, the government would have your fingerprint and pretty much know whether you voted for Chavez or not. And this was enough, this was startling enough to the opposition that they just didn't run in the race. And as a result, Chavistas won all the seats in the legislature. By the point that that happened, we could no longer consider this a free and fair electoral system, and Venezuela had been pushed towards authoritarianism. So you can see that these are really different circumstances, what happened in Chile versus what happened in Venezuela. Now, in the past, coups were the dominant mode of democratic collapse. The blue bars there have 1946 to 2010, so the bulk of the post-World War II period. And you can see that if we look at all those years at this 1946 to 2010 period, 60% of democracies fell apart through coup, and authoritarianizations only made up about 27% or so of democratic collapses. But if you fast forward to the most recent decade for which we have data, 2000 to 2010, we see that coups have declined quite a bit and that authoritarianizations have started to rival them in terms of their frequency. Now, if we were to fast forward to 2010 to the 2020 period, we would see that authoritarianizations now are the most dominant way that democracies fall apart. There have been a number of instances of this happening in Turkey, as I mentioned, but also Nicaragua, Bangladesh, and so forth. So the message here is that coups are now on the decline. They still happen from time to time, but the major way that democracies are vulnerable to collapse is through these incumbent-led takeovers, where democratically elected leaders dismantle democracy from within. Okay, I'm now going to really hit home some of the ways that authoritarianizations are different. And here is Maduro, the successor of Chavez, who has continued Chavez's authoritarianism. If anything, he's made it worse. Coups are substantially more risky than authoritarianizations. They're also more difficult to execute. So a military coup requires an outsider coming in, or military member coming in and trying to disarm the leadership. Well, about half of coups fail. That's a really high percentage. Half of coups fail. And you can imagine that the consequences of staging a failed coup are very serious. So the risks are very high for coup plotters that, you know, if they should fail in their effort, they're often imprisoned or sometimes killed. With an authoritarianization, you have an incumbent seizing power. So Chavez, Erdogan, Daniel Ortega, who we'll talk about later, all these people have access to the state and its resources. And this also makes it easier to carry out this effort. They can use this superior access to state resources to slowly dismantle democracy. The other way that authoritarianizations are different is that they are slow and incremental. And this is very important because the slowness and dragged out nature of these takeovers make them very difficult to push back against. There's not this single moment that can coalesce the opposition and unite them. And the same thing is true for the international community. The international community often does not know how to respond, how to pressure these governments in the face of these very gradual and subtle efforts that are troubling for democracy. Okay, so those are some of the main ways that authoritarianizations are different. And they actually have a lot of advantages from the perspective of a would-be autocrat because they are easier. They require less coordination. You just have a single person and their cronies taking control. And they can take place over the period of many years. Now, having studied these authoritarianizations, these post-Cold War authoritarianizations in particular, there are a number of themes that come to the fore. And what we're seeing is that these incumbents use some central messages to justify their takeovers. Now, one of them is that elites are corrupt. They like to target the traditional political establishment as troublesome, as needing fixing. They say that experts can't be trusted. Experts in many ways are threatening to would-be authoritarians because they might challenge some of their assertions or statements. So the response is just to say, you can't trust these experts. They're not telling you the truth. Another central message is that traditional institutions don't work, that the system itself is failing, that it needs some sort of savior to come in and cure society's ills. And then lastly, that citizens are going to need this strong and decisive leader to be able to fix everything. Now, these same types of messages are often mentioned in association with populism. That's a buzzword that's been in the media a lot in the past decade or so. And while these messages do share a lot in common with populism, I try to avoid using that word for reasons that I'll get into later, but mainly because it's conceptually blurry. So regardless, these are some of the central messages that we can see these authoritarian, eventual authoritarian leaders use to justify their actions. Okay, so words are all fine and dandy. Who cares about your rhetoric? What really matters is what you end up doing when you're in power. And again, we're seeing some very central or common themes in terms of the activities of these leaders who carry out incumbent takeovers. The first is that they put their loyalists in high positions of power. Now, the two very critical arenas where they tend to infiltrate these institutions with their cronies are in the judiciary and in the security services. They try to put loyalists in the judiciary to ensure that court rulings no longer provide a check on their leadership. And they likewise try to put their cronies in the security services to protect themselves against the potential for a coup or some sort of military action to check their actions. They also target the media. The media is often thought of as like the fourth branch of government. And in many ways, we rely on our media to provide us information about leaders' behaviors. Well, the media are a major target. So we're going to see censorship, sidelining of the traditional media, trying to seek out independent media, buying off the media, arresting critical journalists, all things that seek to dismantle a free media as we traditionally conceive of it, and disseminate the news landscape with the leader's message. We're also going to see lawsuits and legislation to marginalize civil society and other opponents. Instead of simply, repressing people who are vocally in opposition to the leadership, instead we're going to see these savvy tactics where lawsuits or new laws are put into place to make sure that civil society is muzzled as well as opponents. So a good example of this comes from Russia, where in 2015, Putin passed a law that branded all foreign NGOs as basically enemies of the state, and they were due to this law, they were forced to stop their operations in Russia. Okay, a recent example of this sort of dynamic happening that I said I'd get to would be Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega, and here he is with his wife, who was also his vice president. Now, Ortega was elected in free and fair elections in 2006. He happened to be part of a dictatorship many years earlier, but there was not talk of authoritarianism when he gained power in 2006. That said, he did a number of things that were detrimental to Nicaraguan democracy. He issued a court ruling that ousted the leader of the main opposition party. He also expelled 16 opposition lawmakers from the National Assembly. He amended the Constitution in 2014 to give him a third term in 2016. And then he also put loyalists in key positions of power, including his wife, as I mentioned, who is the vice president. And the reason this is troubling is that these individuals often did not have the political qualifications to secure these positions. The main qualification that they had was that they were loyal to Ortega. So all of these things were kind of troubling. But none of these events just said, okay, Nicaraguan democracy is dead. That said, the accumulation of these factors, coupled with some very shady elections in 2016, led to the demise of Nicaraguan democracy. And indeed, things have gotten substantially worse since 2016. Another example is Hungary under Viktor Orban. He's now called the Dictator. I don't know if you've heard that term, because he's edged that country towards authoritarianism. Hungary had stable democracy since the end of the Cold War, but then Orban has, over the course of his second tenure, dismantled it. So what did he do? Well, the lead newspaper closed after revealing that Geddes, the coalition of parties that support Orban, had a scandal. So that's targeting the media. He then changed electoral rules to favor his coalition. This is very savvy. It's legal to do this. You can change the rules that are in place to determine how votes are translated into seats. But he did so in ways that ensured that his coalition was going to be victorious. He also had unequal government access to the media. And then in 2018, the parliamentary elections were criticized by monitors. So in my view, because the integrity of the 2018 election had been jeopardized, that was the moment that Hungary transitioned to dictatorship. Others might disagree. They might say that the nail in the coffin was the 2020 decree, or decision for him to rule by decree. Either way, similar types of tactics, lots of different strategies being used to undermine democracy. Okay, now there are many hotspots globally where democracy is under threat. A big one is in El Salvador under Bukele, who really fits the mold in terms of doing all of these same strategies. The Philippines under Duterte is also a potential risk area. It remains to be seen what is going to happen there, whether his daughter is going to end up carrying on with his tradition or some other ally. And then Poland under the Law and Justice Party. But I could list many other places that are hotspots as well. Now, I mentioned that this is troubling. And the reason that this is so troubling is that this specific mode of democratic collapse ushers in a personalist form of dictatorship. So from 1946 to 1999, 44% of authoritarianizations led to personalist dictatorship. But that number has increased dramatically since 2000, where 75% are now leading to personalist rule. And it kind of makes sense. You have this personalist rule are dictatorships where you have a single individual in power. Very few other actors that can constrain the leadership. So impotent parties, impotent security sectors, and so forth. Now, authoritarianizations are often sold as, strategies where you need a strong leader, you need somebody decisive. Well, that's really going to pave the way for this specific brand of authoritarian rule, where you have one person in power. Okay, why does personalist rule matter? Turns out that this is a really bad form of dictatorship. So here I have some very famous personalist dictators: Idi Amin of Uganda, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. The research, a large body of political science research, has shown that personalist dictators are more likely to start wars. They are more likely to escalate disputes with other countries. They're more likely to get into skirmishes. They're more likely to make foreign policy mistakes. They don't have any actors around who can constrain them. And so they might do things that are unwise or unpredictable, as both of the leaders' whose photos I have here indicate. They both did some very wild and ill-advised choices. And they're more likely to hold on to power until the very end. They've usually created so many enemies that by the time that that things get bad for them, they go down in a bloodbath. And again, Amin and Gaddafi are indicative of that. For this reason, they are also the least likely of all dictatorships to democratize. So we see that this specific type of authoritarianism is really responsible for a lot of global instability, of war. Look what's happening right now with Russia and the Ukraine, where Putin is being very provocative. That is very much on trend with what we know about personalist dictatorships. We also know that they're not very likely to democratize. The things that they set in motion while in power basically are very harmful to democratic transition and eventual stability. So these are kind of the bad guys of authoritarians, and yet we're seeing that this new form of democratic collapse is paving the way for this specific form of dictatorship. So some indicators of personalist dictatorship that you could be on the lookout for are the use of referendum or plebiscites as a way of making decisions. We've seen this happen in Turkey, where the leadership basically tries to take advantage of a somewhat public vote to make their choices, even though these votes are usually rigged. They might put loyalists in key positions of power, something I've already mentioned. They are often likely to promote family members to powerful posts. And they often create a new political party or movement. We saw this happen with Putin in Russia, as well as with Chavez and Hungary with Orban, where he was a founding member of the Fidesz coalition. So they basically sidelined the traditional political establishment and co-opt these new groups, which they use as launching pads for their rule. Now, we've seen a rise of personalist dictatorships globally. So this shows from 1945 to 2010 or so. And you can see that during like the hot period of the Cold War, dominant party regimes were really the most common form of dictatorship. They've been on the decline since the Cold War's end. Military dictatorships have also been on the decline. But if you look at that jagged line of personalist dictatorships, you can see that they've been steadily increasing in number and basically are now outpacing party regimes as the most common form of authoritarianism. Okay, so why do leaders get away with this? Where are the people in all this? What's going on? Well, what we see happening, and this is something that I'm doing research on right now, but there are a number of dynamics that are important to highlight. One is that the supporters of the leader are often either unwilling or unable to push back against their actions. And this is actually probably the most critical factor that enables an authoritarian takeover like this. Here is an image from Venezuela where there's this guy who's a member of this country club. And the membership to the country club costs 458 times the ordinary Venezuelan's salary. So we're seeing some extreme inequality. For the people who are benefiting from the status quo, they are going to be very reluctant, like this guy who's been clearly benefiting from the status quo. They're going to be reluctant to give up power. There's also research that shows that these personalists, these leaders, these would-be authoritarians, they're very divisive. Their actions divide the public. They cause political polarization. And that polarization, in turn, leads their supporters to be willing to sacrifice democracy in return for avoiding their opponents from getting into power. As the societal divide intensifies, suddenly the thought of your opponent getting into office, of the opposing party getting into office, is so scary that you're willing to accept subtle degradations of democracy. And again, this is kind of the primary factor that we're seeing that is enabling authoritarianizations. We often want to look to the opposition to stop what's happening, but really the responsibility lies with members of the leader's party, with ordinary people who support the leader's original ascension to power, and so forth. The other factor that matters is that for the opposition, it's very difficult to mobilize against these actions because there's not this big triggering event that could effectively mobilize them. We saw this to some degree during the Trump years in the United States, where there were a lot of subtle things that seemed to be very troubling for American democracy, but it wasn't enough for major mobilization. The January 6th Capitol riot, insurrection, was one example of such a big event that there was quite a bit of mobilization afterwards, but we can talk about the limits of that event later. So regardless, the key focal point often is on these supporters and whether they're willing to go along with this or not. Okay, so why now? I'm going to close up here with a couple of statements regarding why we're seeing this now. This is all going to be conjecture. This is really kind of where the research needs to go, is better understanding how the environment globally has changed to facilitate what's happening. One thing is that the post-Cold War consensus has been that democracy has won out. If you look at public opinion polls, there is something like 90% of ordinary people around the world prefer democracy to its alternative. So there really is this consensus that democracy is the preferred form of government. As a result, because of this citizen support for the democratic model, there are pressures to kind of maintain the facade of democracy. You'll see international rewards, higher levels of foreign aid, for example, for countries that seem to adopt these democratic institutions. So if you are a would-be authoritarian, you are better off taking democracy apart from within rather than aligning behind a military coup, because you're going to be more likely to get away with this and sell this as some sort of legitimate action. So part of it is this evolution in the post-Cold War landscape. The other part of this that I am currently researching right now is the demise of the traditional political party and the rise of new technologies, specifically social media. So everybody knows social media is on the rise. It's here to stay. We can pretend that we're going to be able to push back against it, but we really can't. And what social media has done is it's given ordinary people a huge platform. So you no longer need an institutionalized political party to win an election campaign. Bukele of El Salvador really illustrates this. He just took to social media to build his following. He created his own political party. The party had no past besides being used as a vehicle to launch him to the presidency. And as a result, because of this, these kind of like weak and fragile or meaningless parties that these leaders are winning power with, there's nobody in their circle who can provide a check on their rule. Everybody exists basically to serve the leader, so we don't see much pushback. I can elaborate on some of that later, but for now, I look forward to your questions. Oh, I have a summary page here, but basically the same messages that these, the mode of democratic collapse today has changed. It's ushering in one-man rule. Essentially, there's one case of a female dictator, and that this has troubling consequences for global peace and prosperity.
So, Macken, we can't hear you here. Can others hear Macken?
Can't hear him.
Hold on, let me text him.
Hello, can you hear me?
You can now.
Okay, that was a little strange. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for that presentation, Professor Frantz. So now we can take the opportunity for people to be able to ask questions. So we can give you all a minute to be able to formulate those, because I know that subject matter is a little dense. But if I can, I'd like to start just by asking a question to be able to expand a little more on authoritarianization. So that the phenomena of a personalist rising to power and being able to consolidate loyalists at the top is a trend we've seen in the US. You can point to Trump and his efforts to be able to put people who think like him, act like him, speak like him, and be able to control things that way. But my question to you, Dr. Frantz, is in the past, have there been countries who have been able to identify authoritarianization as it was happening and take efforts to stop it, either through institutions or through civilian uprising or other means?
That's a great question. So in general, once these backsliding events have started, they are somewhat difficult to reverse. That said, there have been a couple of instances of success stories, I guess you could say. One, the most notable would be from Ecuador, where the leadership there had basically started to target the media, really censor academics and so forth. This was under Rafael Correa. And then he ended up leaving power and transitioning to a designated successor. So this Lenin Moreno. And no one really thought that his successor would actually reverse what had happened. But in fact, he did. And he basically moved Ecuador back on a solid path of democracy. So there, the pivotal moment was the leadership transition. But these leaders don't always step down. So, Correa thought that he could get his successor to kind of continue with his path. It didn't happen. So perhaps it was a little bit of luck in that situation. I have other things that I could say, but it looks like we have some questions. So maybe we can, which might be similar.
Yeah, that would be perfect. So I could just read these out for you and I'll just do that for you. So this kind of builds on what I was proposing, but Joel and Kathleen Hoffman ask,
how do we fight back in the US against the rise of this personalism, this trend of authoritarianization?
So the US is in a precarious situation because on the one hand, it seemed like very promising that there was a leadership transition. And, regardless of your partisanship, most experts assessed that the quality of American democracy declined under Trump. So if we just kind of, put aside whether you support taxes or whether you support, abortion, whatever, if we just talk about the quality of democracy, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the quality of American democracy deteriorated under his rule. And there were many fears that he might hold on to power, even if he lost the race. Instead, we saw something that was really unexpected with this violent insurrection that it really is anomalous. I study authoritarian politics. We don't see things like this happening. So on the one hand, there's a bright light that we did have a leadership transition. On the other hand, that transition was violent. And there is a lot of evidence that there are efforts underway on behalf of Trump and his supporters to ensure fraudulent electoral victories down the road, primarily through things like gerrymandering and restricting the access to vote. So, I have mentioned that the supporters are very important. We have not seen enough pushback on the insurrection from the elite in the Republican Party, which we would, if anything, we're seeing more and more vocal support for that action. So that's troubling. Ideally, the pushback against Trump needs to happen from within the Republican Party, where ordinary Republicans, members of the Republican elite, push back against these actions. For that to happen, they need to see it as in their interests to do so. So long as they think that their political futures are aligned with Trump, we're going to be unlikely to see resistance to his efforts.
Thank you. And it's so concerning because the US is seen by so many as the bastion of democracy. So seeing this Democrat backsliding so surprising to so many people that people don't even think it can happen here on this soil.
Right.
So thank you for hitting on that.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about this contemporary wave of democratic decline is that it's happening in surprising places. Now, on the one hand, there are democratic victories in places we wouldn't necessarily expect, like Burkina Faso is a democracy. We don't necessarily hear that headline. But what usually democracies are protected by being rich and by having a long period of democratic rule. The US hits both of those points. Hungary, to a certain degree, hits those points. Same thing with Poland. And yet we're seeing these places under kind of turning on its head what we traditionally thought about with respect to democratic consolidation. I see a question about Trump's anti-democratic actions that I think is worth discussing. So in general, the biggest anti-democratic action actually happened before the 2020 election, where he started to call into question the integrity of our elections. There is no evidence that the US has any serious level of fraudulence in its electoral contests. So the expert opinion there is pretty unanimous. But as part of his strategy of maintaining power, he started early on to question the validity of expert views. And he started to sow seeds of doubt among his supporters over the legitimacy of democratic institutions. Now, democratic institutions, elections, all these things are really rules on paper. They only matter to the extent that there are norms of behavior that support them. So we have a democracy because as ordinary citizens, we've decided that people are going to show up and vote in elections and that we're going to respect the result. If we start to sow doubt in that electoral process, in this legitimacy, we have started to sow doubt in the norms of behavior that kind of support democracy in the US. So that's the big thing that is troubling. But prior to that, there was a lot of messing around with judicial nominations in ways that were troubling, and a lot of mistreatment of the media and efforts to sideline the traditional media, disinformation campaigns, efforts to control the narrative and basically put out lies, which all politicians kind of do, but this was unprecedented in terms of the ways that it really pushed people to the fringe in their news digesting or whatever however you would put it.
Digging a little deeper into elections, because that is something that's seen as so integral to democracies, being able to choose your own leaders through a free and fair means. Marna Wilson asks in a slightly bleak way, could Trump possibly become a dictator and be able to throw away with all of those elections, at least for the presidency?
Yeah, and that seems pretty obvious now, particularly given what we have seen following the insurrection, where there really was not enough of an uproar about what had happened. So I often try to redirect the focus away from the individual politician and towards that politician's support group. There are would-be authoritarians everywhere. So people like Trump exist all over the place. It's not that unusual for individuals to try to seek to maximize power. What is unusual is that those around him are not pushing back against it. And part of the reason for this is that they see his success as integral to their own political futures. So they're nervous that the Republican Party is nervous that it can't be electorally successful unless it aligns itself with Trump. And so for that reason, we haven't really seen a serious enough breaking away. Now, before the insurrection, I never had much media attention on the US. Like, people did not ask me questions about the US. That all changed once Trump got elected. But I still would try to emphasize to people that the risk of dictatorship in the US was still really low. It might have been higher than normal, but low compared to most countries in the world. Since January 6th, however, and what's happened subsequently with all of these efforts to gerrymander and keep certain groups of the population from voting, the concerns are quite a bit more serious.
Speaking on that point, Bennett, sorry, I don't know if that's her first or last name, but Bennett actually just asked a very good question about the suppression of certain groups. Bennett asks, does preventing illegal aliens from voting amount to improper voter suppression?
So according to our, suffrage, if you were a citizen and so forth, and you meet certain categories of, the felony laws vary state by state, but if you're a citizen, you should have the right to vote if you're over 18. So we're talking about people who, have citizenship, should legally be allowed to vote, but instead there are certain restrictions that are being put in place that are seeking to disadvantage them and make it difficult to vote. So, I did an interview with a German reporter, and he said off the record, I just can't understand why in the US you're trying to keep citizens from voting. That didn't make any sense to him. And indeed, it is kind of like very curious. Why, as a democracy, would we not want everyone to have the right to vote who legally can? There's very little evidence of fraudulent IDs being used to vote. So these things like making people wait in very long lines are seeking to disadvantage people who have jobs. The accumulation of evidence is pretty serious, that there have been targeted approaches to try to keep certain groups from voting who should otherwise have that right.
Thank you. Turning real quick, we have a question from the Robertson room.
Yeah, I understand carefully. So preventing illegal aliens from voting is a different thing. They've never been allowed to vote. On the other hand, right? On the other hand, another thing of great concern to me is giving partisan officials control over the vote.
So I'm not talking about efforts to keep undocumented immigrants from voting. I'm talking about efforts to keep particularly communities of color from voting. And these things that try to make, there are plenty of documented immigrants, of people who are naturalized citizens, who they should have the right to vote. And yet there is a lot of suspicious behavior occurring to try to prevent these populations from voting. The evidence there is pretty damning in terms of what's happening. And again, we have our rules in place that dictate who should be able to vote and who shouldn't. And we should, as a democracy, for the election to be free and fair, those requirements need to be met.
Thank you for clarifying that. Turning away from the United States a little bit to another country on a slightly different part of the world, Lebanon. Frank says that Lebanon doesn't seem to fit any of the categories of countries that you've described in your presentation. Frank wants to get a little more information on what your perspective is of Lebanon as a regime.
So Lebanon has too small of a population size to be in my data set. So as a result, I am not a specialist on Lebanon, nor do I know much about Lebanese politics. I apologize there. Lebanon has had its own flirtations with authoritarianism. Some might call it a hybrid system, but again, I apologize. I don't have much expertise in Lebanon. We have these smaller population countries are not in my data set.
That's all right. Turning to Penny Schwartz, just talking in general terms. Penny would like you to speak a little more on how economic inequality benefits a shift to authoritarianization, if it does.
So the research on economic inequality is somewhat mixed. It does seem that economic equality is facilitating authoritarianism, but it's a kind of nuanced relationship in that it's not the actual level of economic inequality that matters. It's your perception of your own economic situation. So aggregate indicators of economic inequality are not always telling. What matters is whether you perceive to be disadvantaged vis-a-vis other groups in your population. And those things can indeed lend themselves to kind of questioning whether the system's working for you and so forth. But in general, these things that are happening among ordinary people are not quite as consequential as what's happening at the top, where the elites are enabling some of these, are leveraging some of these societal divides for their own political purposes.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Dr. Waller.
Erica, thank you. That was enormously informative. This is certainly not an area I know a great deal about, but I'm somewhat familiar with literature indicating that the higher the GDP, the more stable a democracy and the lower the likelihood of slipping into dictatorship. And there are various theories. One, that if power and wealth are widely distributed, more people have a vested interest in sticking with democracy. But also the damage done to business, on which many people depend, will be high if it's a rich country. And so the elites tend to back off. I don't know, could you comment on that relationship between high GDP and stable democracy? And also the extent to which that will protect countries like America or Britain in the future?
Yeah, so I mentioned it earlier that the two major factors that contribute to democratic stability are levels of wealth, GDP, as you mentioned, and also your history of democracy. So these countries that have been democratic for a long time and are rich tend to be protected from democratic breakdown. However, we're seeing this start to fray in recent years, and we don't totally understand why. It's going against the conventional academic wisdom that levels of wealth are very much a protector. And to be clear, levels of wealth are also a protector for autocracies, which is why we see so much conversation about how is China's economy doing? Is there going to be some sort of economic crisis in China that destabilizes it? High levels of wealth, prosperity, lessen the chance that you're going to see instability in the form of protests, domestic unrest, things that really threaten and make these places vulnerable. So in general, these leaders are better off if there is smooth sailing with the economy. Now, again, we don't totally know why this seems to be changing. Why is it that a place like India, which, comparatively speaking, is a fairly rich country, why are we seeing democracy vulnerable there, or in the US or the UK? I don't have a very satisfying answer. We're looking at the rise of, in research I'm doing right now, we're looking at the rise of these kind of hollowed out political parties and the ways in which they're facilitating the actions of these leaders. But it's, new research, and we don't really have a definitive answer yet.
Thank you for that. So our next theme of questions are going to turn to the nature of strongman dictatorships. Our first question in that regard is going to come from Nancy Pogel, and she asks, to what extent do special major occurrences, such as the current COVID pandemic, contribute to the rise or onset of strongman dictatorships?
That's a great question, and one that was very much on the minds of, on my mind and those of my colleagues at the start of the pandemic. There was a lot of fear that the places that are kind of vulnerable to authoritarianism would actually collapse because their leaders would use it as an opportunity to cut back on human rights. So the data now suggests two things have happened since the pandemic. The first is that the pandemic was not actually the cause of democratic collapse in many places. It didn't actually lead to a decline in the quality of democracy, which is kind of good news. Now, there's fears that surveillance technologies might be abused in the future in those places which have used those technologies as a form of combating the pandemic. But to date, there's not very much strong evidence that the pandemic was leveraged by these democratic incumbents to push their countries towards dictatorship. The second message, though, is that in dictatorships, the pandemic was abused by the leadership. So Hungary is a great example where Orban decided to use, under the auspices of this pandemic, issue a decree to entrench his rule. So in many places around the globe that are already authoritarian, the pandemic was used as a justification for entrenchment of authoritarianism. It made things worse in a lot of dictatorships.
Thank you. That's so captivating. And I suppose there's a glimmer of optimism there for countries that are democratic or democratic leaning. But
Yeah, that's a good news part. Yes.
Yeah, so a glimmer of hope. Our next question regarding strongman dictatorships comes from Marna Wilson, and she asks, does a country ever have a chance to return to democracy after a strongman dictatorship, and how exactly does that come about?
That is a good question. I don't have a great answer. So yes, certainly there's a chance for democracy after personalist rule. That said, understanding why some personalists are on a path towards democracy and others aren't is still somewhat poorly understood. We know that it helps if the leader is a civilian. So, if the leader had some tie to the military, like Idi Amin or something like that, the chance of democracy is pretty low. That said, most of today's personalist leaders are indeed civilians. And the chances of democracy, according to the data, are fairly low. Likewise, there are many countries that once had collegial rule that are now moving towards greater personalism. China is the biggest example of this. China under Xi Jinping has moved towards more of a personalist system, which really dims the prospect for democracy in China. So our two major dictatorships in the world today, powerful dictatorships, Russia and China, both of them, according to current trends, would be unlikely candidates for democracy. I apologize, I don't have more of a insight into what conditions will facilitate democratization in these places. But the research is still nascent in that regard.
And I suppose that's just the nature of it, isn't it? Using empirical data to be able to explain these phenomena in countries. Like that's something that's just inherently difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, and academics are sometimes slow to catch up to global global developments. We know that personalism is on the rise. Well, it takes like 5 years to gather data on levels of personalism and that you need to investigate some of these things. So in some ways, we're slow to catch up. Another area where we've been kind of slow to catch up is in the use of digital technologies for political survival purposes. We know that Democrats and authoritarians are using digital tools to strengthen their rule in negative ways, but better understanding the dynamics underlying those relationships is in need of future research. We are kind of playing catch up in terms of getting the data to be able to evaluate those things.
A quick question about tools, actually, since you bring that up. What are some of the common tools that social scientists like you use in measuring the differences in quality of life between countries that are dictatorships versus personalists or autocracies? What are some of those numbers, and where do you get them from typically?
That's a great question. I do a lot of consultant work for the US government, and they are often curious whether democracy matters. So, is it worth it at all to try to advocate for democracy? And overwhelmingly, the data indicate that it is worth it. Now, it's somewhat normative in terms of like which indicator you're particularly going to be interested in. But we know that democracies are more likely to respect human rights than dictatorships. Most people care about human rights. It seems like you would not want there to be political prisoners and so forth. So that the reasons underlying that are fairly obvious, but democracies have a better human rights record than dictatorships. Democracies are more likely to invest in public goods than dictatorships. So you're going to see better education, better roads, better access to water. So that's another somewhat normatively positive outcome. Democracies are also less corrupt than dictatorships. They tend to have higher life expectancy. There are a lot of things that we could, from a normative perspective, care about that democracies are associated with. So there is something, and this is even used in a very basic definition of democracy that just looks at those places that have free and fair elections. It turns out that having free and fair elections actually means a lot for the quality of life of the ordinary citizens living under these places.
Thank you so much. So we'd still like to welcome a couple of more questions. We have about 15 more minutes scheduled. So anything you'd like to have clarified or want Dr. Frantz to dig deeper into, we'd be happy to ask her.
Okay, well, I have a question. I would like to ask if there's anything you think the Biden administration could do to prevent the rise of authoritarian rule here. Like they could put out some rhetoric or try and pursue a legislative action, something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not a specialist on American politics, but it does seem like any actions that seek to preserve the integrity of elections would be valuable. So free and fair elections are, the core of our system. So to the extent that we can make sure, one of the audience members mentioned, we don't want partisanship in terms of who's counting the votes. We don't want partisans determining electoral districts and how they're set up. Anything that at the local level can ensure that these elections are meet international standards of freeness and fairness would be very important. And also any actions to seriously punish the perpetrators of the insurrection, to me, is very consequential. We cannot have leadership turnovers involve the use of violence. There need to be consequences to send a message that that's unacceptable in a democracy. That we can't tolerate those sorts of behaviors. So those are somewhat basic things that I think should be on the forefront, ensuring that those who should have the right to vote can, according to our laws, and that these contests are free and fair. That's the backbone of any democracy, and to me would be pretty important here. To the extent that the Biden administration has control over social media and misinformation, I don't think it does, but that also would be fairly consequential because we've seen a muddying of our information environment where ordinary people no longer can differentiate what's truth and what's not.
Thank you for that insight. Our next question is going to come from the Robertson room, it looks like.
Okay, Thank you, Professor Frantz, for your talk. I found it very interesting and informative. But, you know, one, I think, major clarification I would want to ask you for. On the one hand, I think you're probably right about the general outcomes of democracy versus dictatorship. But my understanding, though, not wishing to whitewash anything, is that if you take China and Vietnam, you've had tremendous increases in prosperity and a number of public goods as well, in terms of, you know, greatly improved infrastructure, et cetera. So that not some dictatorships, you know, basically break down the structure of society. Others, even while they are repressive, can build up a lot of the good things that we all want.
That's a great point. So in dictatorships, there's a lot more latitude to do as you please. You don't face the same types of gridlock that you might have in a democracy. And some dictatorships can use that freedom to do good. You mentioned Vietnam and China. Another really great example is Singapore, which is one of the richest countries in the world, and it's a dictatorship. So you have, you know, so-called benevolent dictators in a number of places, well, not a number, but in a handful of places around the world, where they're using their positions of power to invest in public goods. They see it as in their long-term interest to do so because it will lead to economic prosperity and so forth. The problem is that you also have a lot of bad dictators who use that same latitude to do harm and to destroy their country's economies. They don't have the, you know, long-term vision of, you know, what would be best for the country 20 years from now, and are instead obsessed with political survival in the near term. So we see that there's a lot more variance in economic outcomes among dictatorships. Most of the economic miracles are going to be in dictatorships, but all of the economic disasters are going to be in dictatorships. So this all averages out to a situation where democracies usually outperform dictatorships. But, you know, again, it's a gamble. If you, for me, I would personally rather take the democratic gamble, where, you know, you have a little bit more assurances of what lies ahead. You're not going to see dramatic political change like you could in China, but you're also not going to see dramatic political change in the opposite direction like you might see in, you know, Belarus.
Thank you.
All right, so it looks like our next question, going back to strongman authoritarian regimes. What happens when a strongman in office dies? Marna Wilson asks.
That's another great question. I have done research on this, and it turns out very little happens. I started looking into this, you know, around the time of the transition of the Kim family in North Korea. And the expectation is you're thinking that, okay, when a dictator dies, that you're going to see political change. And instead, the data suggests that it's really uncommon. We usually see more of the same when a dictator dies. Now, to be clear, the probability of political change is somewhat higher when a dictator dies than in other years, but the likelihood of a transition is actually pretty low. So we usually see more stability when these leaders die. And that's because the elite that surround them often have incentive to coalesce around a successor than face the uncertain prospects that could happen if the regime fell. So, you know, there is some potential for political change, but in general, we usually see political continuity.
Thank you. So our next question is going to be from Joel and Kathy Hoffman once again. They ask whether systems thinking is used by political scientists to analyze situations. And they say that 14 years of decline in democracy indicates that there's been a change in the environment that caused this phenomenon.
You know, there certainly has to be some sort of systemic change that is facilitating this overall decay in democracy. We don't totally understand what it is, though. And a lot of pundits have rushed out and blamed, you know, the refugee crisis, or the economic crisis. There are a lot of potential factors that we could link to that would cause this disillusionment with democracy. And it's possible that those things are true, but we don't have any systematic evidence yet to say that one thing matters more than another. I mentioned that we're looking into the role of political parties, and there has been a decline in traditional parties, particularly in Western Europe, where the same parties that used to be popular no longer are. And in their place, we're seeing these kind of personalist vehicles like Bukele in El Salvador, where the party only exists to support that leader. Once those parties win office, and they often win office just because voters are so fed up with traditional parties, the party elite tend to be pretty impotent and don't do much to push back against incumbent power grabs. So I think that in many ways, I'm saying I think because I don't know, this is like my opinion, I think social media is helping facilitate the rise of these new parties, because you no longer need a strong party institution to spread your message. Anybody can do it. Anybody can win office today. And on the one hand, that's somewhat democratizing. Anybody can win. On the other hand, there's the same vetting that parties do, that the on the ground grassroots work that we require from parties no longer exists, which can lead to kind of wild and unconstrained behaviors.
Thank you for that. It looks like we have time for maybe a couple more questions from anyone who still would like things clarified or is curious about anything or has anything else they'd like to know from Dr. Frantz. Looks like we have James Anderson raising his hand. If you'd like to unmute and ask, that's fine. If you would like to type, that's all right too. Oh, James, it looks like we can't hear you.
Oh, I saw a question in the chat.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There we go. Yes.
I was wondering, on a very broad basis, to take this slightly different part of the world, this analysis, can you tell me if much work has been done with regards to the Arab Spring, what happened after it now, and of course the situation before? There was a heavy amount of dictatorships before the Arab Spring, some change, and we seem to be back, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that part of the world in just a little way.
Sure. Yeah, the Arab Spring took, I mean, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, but it took even experts on the Middle East totally by surprise. No one was expecting that suddenly we would see these revolutions in so many places. And this was all in 2011, roughly. There was a lot of optimism that we were going to see long-lasting political change. In the end, the only regime that democratized was Tunisia. And now we're seeing right now that Tunisian democracy is very much under threat. So unfortunately, the Arab Spring has been pretty much a big disappointment in terms of the outcomes. There was also optimism at that time that new technologies were going to basically like lead to new freedoms for people, that, you know, access to social media was going to facilitate mass mobilization, the types of mass mobilization we saw in the Arab Spring. But what we did not anticipate was that these authoritarians were, you know, they didn't sit idly by. They adjusted in response and are now using these new technologies to strengthen their rule. In fact, those regimes that have some openness with new technologies have a higher likelihood of survival than those that don't. So they're manipulating these digital tools in ways that suit them by monitoring ordinary people's networks and their behaviors, gathering information about dissent. In a purely closed environment, they don't know much about ordinary people's sentiments, but with the internet and social media, they can monitor activities and get a better idea of the pulse, and then target their repressive responses more efficiently. So, and a lot of that research has come out of what happened in the Arab Spring. where, these new technologies, on the one hand, they have led to more protests. On the other hand, these protests are less effective at facilitating or engendering political change.
Thank you. It looks like in closing, we just have one more question from Gary Smith. Dr. Frantz, are you, turning back to the United States, are you personally optimistic or pessimistic about the 2024 election?
That was the question I was kind of chuckling about. I'm kind of an optimistic person, so I think everything's going to be fine. But then again, part of the reason that it seems like everything should be fine is that we have such a long history of democracy. The democracy has survived, some fits and starts, and it seems like in general, Americans are no different than other global citizens and support the idea of democracy. So, I am personally optimistic. At the same time, it is very important that we understand that election will be a moment where there is opportunity for reversion to authoritarianism. So the probability of some sort of political instability is substantially higher. The probability of that moment ushering in a period of authoritarianism is higher than it would be otherwise. So we can't be fools and just, sit around and assume everything's going to be fine. We need to act in ways that preserve the integrity of elections. But, in general, I tend to feel like things are going to be okay here. We're certainly in a better situation than, some other democracies that are under threat. But, we also can't let our guard down.
I think that's a perfect note, Professor. That just that there's a lot we can't there's a lot that we can't change on the personal level, and it might be a bleak outlook, but as responsible citizens, we need to know what else is going on in the world and how these regimes are structured, and that offers a lot of lessons and insights into what's going on in the country. So that's a perfect note. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for your wonderful questions for Dr. Frantz. Professor, Dr. Frantz, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here tonight. Thank you for your time and your wonderful presentation. And it was such an honor to be able to have you here.
Thanks so much for doing a great job moderating and for all of these really excellent questions. I speak about this a lot, and these questions were very thoughtful, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hope you all have a happy holiday.
Are those guitars behind you?
My husband's a musician, so I have like every stringed instrument in our shared office that you can think of. Yeah.
Are there any of them ukuleles?
There's a ukulele. There's a Cuban tres. There's I don't even know what some of these are. Yes.
Thank you.
Erica, just a final word of gratitude. So pleased we could end this this season of Town and Gown on such a masterclass. So really thank you. Thank you again for everybody for attending. You will all have received in your email inboxes a lineup for the spring. We don't know what order they'll appear in yet, but I think you'll be very pleased with the people who have agreed to participate next year. So thank you all again. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Macken. And happy holidays, and see you next year.
Great. Thank you so much again. Take care.